Na, mach. Jetzt wollen wir jetzt gleich die Spiele anfangen. Doppelklick ins Video. Ins Video Doppelklick. Zack, zack. Ja, dann ist es Vollbild. Das passt. Willst du von Anfang an spielen? Ja. Mikrofon einschalten, nicht vergessen. Und so weiter und so fort. Ton ist klar, oder? Ja, logisch.
For those among you who would like to join Mark's 48 hours Hypertext challenge, it's now the time to come in.
Yeah, I spent many months studying before my experiment.
Ich bin
Welcome to this afternoon session. May I introduce to you Dame Wendy Hall. I contacted her earlier, informing her about the Hypertext conference and the 30th anniversary, and the idea that it would be nice to have her participating as a keynote speaker or participant, because I really think this would be would have been nice to have someone who did some research in hypertext and was working on a impressive system, microcosm, earlier, who was in contact also with hypertext people like Tim Berners-Lee, bringing up the Web Science conference and field of research, to have a person like her participating. Unfortunately, she didn't have time because she is traveling this week, and also it was not possible actually to for her to give a keynote lecture due to some time constraints. But she agreed to record a short message, 5 minutes of thinking about, reflecting upon hypertext, and I would like to show this to you, and I appreciate that Wendy Hall actually took the time to record this message to pass her thoughts on hypertext, and in particular the Hypertext conference and the 30th anniversary to you. So I'm playing this, and afterwards I hand over the microphone to Mark Bernstein for his 48-hour Hypertext challenge. So this is Wendy Hall.
Hello everybody, I'm really sorry, genuinely sorry that I can't be with you in Germany today. I have always been a supporter of the Hypertext conferences, and it was what gave me my start in my academic career. But I just couldn't, I'm just frighteningly busy these days, and I couldn't make this week. And I hope you're all having a wonderful time. So my reflections on Hypertext conferences, I didn't go to the first two in America. My first Hypertext conference was not an ACM conference, it was ACT 1990, a European Conference on Hypertext, and I think there's a meaning of ACT in German, which was a bit of a pun, but that was in Paris, December 1990, and that was the conference where I met Tim Berners-Lee for the first time. We were there talking about microcosm, and in fact I met Andrew Fountain the other day, who was the lead author on that paper, the microcosm paper in the 1990 conference. He's still going strong. That was the conference I famously met Tim Berners-Lee and Robert Caillou for the first time. Tim was talking about the system he was going to call the World Wide Web, and we were talking about microcosm. And then the following year, we all went to Hypertext 91 in San Antonio, that conference rejected our second paper on microcosm and also rejected Tim's paper about the World Wide Web. I remember that was the first conference where I saw Tim demo the World Wide Web. He both simulated a demo and paid from his own credit card to get a phone line back to CERN or somewhere to do the demo over the internet. We were demoing microcosm, and I also remember that there was a tequila fountain in the courtyard outside the hotel. This was San Antonio in December, but beautiful weather as I recall, before it started raining, or with rain afterwards. But that evening there was a tequila fountain in the courtyard, and everyone was drinking margaritas and weren't very interested in the demos. But this was the beginning of something. I think we had another European conference in '92, and by '93, which was in Seattle, organised by the Boeing guys, over half the demos were World Wide Web demos. So the web had begun to take off. And in those days, the SIG group was called SIG Link. And there was a movement to create a SIG web. And I was a bit worried about this because I thought, well, Hypertext, we really need to be involved. We don't want a competitive SIG web. That needs to be our SIG, and we need to make sure Hypertext is in pole position when it comes to the web conference. So at the Pittsburgh conference in '98, I remember persuading people to change the name of the special interest group, the ACM special interest group, from SIG-Link to SIG-Web. But we didn't seize the opportunity. We carried on as the Hypertext Conference for good or for bad, and the Web Conference, which of course I've been involved with all these years as well, carried on separately. That may be changing in the near future, but we will see. We will see. I think the Web Conference may be coming home, but that's for another day. So what do I remember about the early days of the Hypertext Conference? I remember them being the most fun conferences I ever went to, and I remember them being very interdisciplinary. We had people there who wrote Hypertext using Storyspace and the other authoring systems. That's when I first met Bart Bernstein. And I remember Hypertext poetry readings over a lot of fine wine at one conference. It was amazingly interdisciplinary and a lot of fun. I remember the people who were involved in Hypertext from the creativity point of view and not just the technical point of view. And that's where I really got my ideas about doing interdisciplinary work in this area that were partly behind what we did with the Web Science Conference. It was, this stuff has to be socio-technical, it isn't just about the technical. So that's the spirit of Hypertext that I'd love, I always remember, and I hope you're recreating at Hypertext 2019, and that you're having a wonderful conference with lots of fine German wine and beer. And again, I'm really sorry I won't be with you. Hope to see you at Hypertext Conference soon, sometime in the future.
Yeah, this was Wendy Hall. I appreciate very much that she gave us a little greeting. And guess what? This afternoon we will have a Hypertext reading. And guess what? We have a Hypertext conference this year, which is truly interdisciplinary. And guess what? I hope you have a lot of fun during this conference as well. So now I hand over to Mark for his 48 hours Hypertext challenge.
You're coming too.
You first.
I see. Brilliant. Okay, could we start with this laptop? I actually temporarily would like to split my screen. I'm not going to worry about that. Okay. 48-hour hypertext. Teeny, you're on this panel. Hello. Teeny, you're on this panel. You're not? Okay, surprise. Ah, okay. Push the middle two back a bit. And okay. Let's try that pocket instead. Okay, 48-hour hypertexts come from an idea I had to remediate a problem. The problem is excellence. Over the years, well, back in the early days, for example, in the era of Hypertext 99, when we learned so much about good German beer, it was very important for hypertexts to argue their excellence and seriousness because especially they were horrible little screens and horrible little plastic boxes, and that's what people saw. And so unless the writing said I am terrific, people would not take this seriously and would dismiss our work as children's toys. And there was a perfectly coherent attack against hypertext, the entire discipline, not just as strange creative types, in the 80s and early 90s that argued that this is all really useful for little children in schools because they're used to looking at screens. You can get them, ease them into serious reading by having them look at screens, and that's all this was good for. So, something that Dave and Charlie said over some good beer caught my ear. They were going to write a locative hypertext that people at a hypertext conference could actually read. And this was exciting. And they had blocked out 2 days in which to work on it because this is what busy professors can do. And a couple of months later, I'm sitting around Eastgate and trying to figure out what on earth to do that the community needs. And 48-hour hypertexts is a very attractive idea. Even a professor can find 48 hours in some form, whether as a weekend or 6 weeks of an hour or two a day. This is not a competition. This is not seeking to be the best 48-hour hypertext. Like NaNoWriMo, if you get to the end, you win. The genesis is Scott McLeod, Hypertext 2000 keynote, started a idea called the 24-hour comic. You take professional comic writers or artists, say, do the whole thing, script and artwork and ink and full color cover, 24-page comic. You have 24 hours, go. This has been quite successful and spawned variants for people who just couldn't pull all-nighters. I anticipated lots of objection about 48 hours based on just, I'm too old for this. But 2 work days, an hour a day for 6 weeks, whatever. The hypertexts that we received, the finished hypertexts, are at this URL. I invite you, I apologize for the URL. I will explain it momentarily. But I urge you to go look, read at your leisure. Another nice thing about 48-hour hypertexts is that they're small. They're all likely to be small because no one writes 1,800 pages in 48 hours. So here's what we had. Clara Fernandez Vera, who teaches game writing at NYU, started a different hypertext project, abandoned it, and with the clock running, wrote Little Red Riding Hood. Who among us has written Little Red Riding Hood? Richard Smith, old-time Eastgate author, reappeared to write a pre-Socratic self-help menu. Jessica Tremblay wrote Wave. Artemio Morales, who has an indie game design studio, wrote Legend of the Girl and the Condor. John McDade, Standing by the Wall. I wrote In Bond and Story Space. And Dave and Charlie wrote The Dean of Liminal Studies. So let's take a look at some of these. And by the way, some of you have already read these, and please chime in. What we're looking at here is what the work is trying to do, not whether it's great or not, because it's 48 hours. It's not supposed to be great. But I think we can learn a lot from them. But what can we learn from Little Red Riding Hood here?
Just, I guess, yeah, so to go on from your gag there a second, I guess, Mark, Little Red has a real sort of position in interactive fiction, in that it is something that so many people learn how to write interactive fiction with. It gets used as a training task in a lot of things. I mean, I'm going to confess, I teach interactive storytelling at my university, and I use Little Red too. So the fact that a teacher of game writing at NYU has chosen to write Little Red has something instantly poetic about it in its own sense. Okay, I think that Kara's rendition of it is a very straight rendition, and that in itself makes it quite novel, because I'm so used to seeing exploratory adaptations of Little Red that the straight story is itself kind of novel. It's a very clean and uncomplicated interpretation of it, but very nice, very nicely written. It even has little elements of sort of, going back to your talk on sort of links as style, little elements of mechanics as metaphor, with the breathing and the running and being in the repetitive links, making use of that sort of transition to carry some of the narrative weight beyond just the words. So yeah, I found it interesting.
So I also thought the mechanics worked really well. So for me, it kind of picks up on some of the things that we've talked about earlier in the conference about what is it about digital text that's interesting. Is it to use the pie metaphor again? Is it the participation? Is it the interaction? And in this case, it's clearly the prose. The prose is the thing. That's what attracts you to the piece. Whereas the interactive structure is present but relatively simple. And I think that contrasts with some of the other pieces in there, and there are also others which are even simpler in their form. So I think it's an interesting example of these different takes and where the emphasis is and where some of the value is. But yeah, a lovely written piece. Yeah.
I mean, one other thing I think I might add is, I think, although the writing is sort of lovely in this one, I think one of the reasons maybe that Little Red gets used so often in these cases is it's a story that has sort of natural a want to branch, a want to be almost sort of technical in a sense, in that there are lots of, it's almost like a sliding doors story, in that there are so many places in which Little Red could fail to save Grandma, or the whole ordeal could fail to happen. So it's very tempting from the point of a digital interactive writer to take this sort of predetermined story that has so many junctures where it could be prevented, in order to force the link into it, in order to create it and make it interactive. So yeah, and again, it's this, and she actively as well, I think it's worth noting, encourages rereading by making that final page link back round to the beginning. So I mean, we've always talked about rereading in hypertext before, that hypertext demands rereading and exploration of the structure, yeah, she has worked straight into that.
Yeah, and not to belabor this one poor page, but one of the hats mostly on the wall these days that I wear is hypertext editor. And as I read this first Lexia, I ran into moniker, and my proverbial red pencil came out, because that's a really strange word, and it's a $5 word that Once Upon a Time isn't going to support. But then you get the bright red cape with the hood she wore, which was a bold fashion statement for her small village. And this is sustained and is actually an adorable, charming use of voice. And to actually sustain this, not critical. And it's hard to, Little Red is a story about sexual hygiene in a closed community. And it's hard to have a modern ironic voice in that without someone like in the Stephen Sondheim Into the Woods, okay? That's a modern Little Red, but it subverts the story of Little Red. Let's...
Sorry, can I just...
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's what I said, yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So this is something that we talk a lot about in game narrative, this idea of mechanics as metaphor, okay, or to be more pretentious, ludonarrative harmony, okay? This idea that the level of interaction itself is in sync with the story, okay? That the linking is actually carrying some of the weight there, and it is, right? That run, breathe, does that. McLuhan, right? So yeah, yeah. The one other thing I was going to add, though, just on the point of the whole 48-hour issue here, there's one little sort of, I guess, kink in the armor with this piece, in that there's a little bit of a diegetic reference issue in a sense, in that if you look in the basket before you go to Grandma's house, it doesn't remember that you've looked in the basket. Little Red will still be surprised by the fact of what's in the basket regardless. And I'm not complaining, 48 hours,
Yeah.
of course. But I think it's interesting to point out that one of the challenges of hypertext authoring is understanding the causality of the tangled web of links that you weave. And one of the challenges of writing these things so quickly, or indeed at all, is the time you have to spend checking the causal pathways of your hypertext. And when you've only got 48 hours, the first thing to go out the window is thorough testing.
And editing.
Okay, Richard Smith, the Pre-Socratic Self-Help Manual.
Yeah, so this sort of dresses itself up as a psychological test. And the bit I like most about this is where it kind of goes off the rails, and it sort of lulls you in with a number of very standard type questions, and then starts asking you about gravitational vortexes and these other things. And so I thought that as a piece that was kind of playing on those tests and the way in which we interpret those tests, I thought that was very effective. It appears to be doing something under the hood, which is actually using your answers quite seriously to to give you a different result. I think we all got different results when we did it. So yes, if you are reading that one, I'd encourage you to answer seriously and find out whether you are was it a bubble or a ash or whatever the rest of it was. Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot.
So I found this one interesting, but I also confess to being somewhat frustrated by it. Not because I thought the writing was bad at all. It's a very interesting idea, and as you say, Dave, sort of playing on this personality test. But I found it sort of a little frustrating in that the algorithm that it is doing in order to calculate your personality, or which of the branches you end up being sieved into, is quite opaque. And I couldn't see the obvious connection between the choices and the agency that I was making and the way I made my way through the system. And on one side, I sort of feel like that's always really frustrating, particularly to someone like me who studies game design, and that you want to feel like there is a connection between action and outcome. But maybe this was kind of the point. Okay, the point is that these sort of personality tests are supposed to feel arbitrary, and maybe that's exactly what he is managing to get across. I mean, I'm not criticizing this just because I ended up being mud, but so.
And I agree, but I found it enjoyable for precisely those reasons, because I was enjoying it at the level of just an absurdist surface that I'm sort of skating through and not trying to figure out what the mechanics are. So I found it just fun.
You see, this is the thing. Although I had a go at writing here, I am definitely a computer scientist first. Okay, I'm an engineer. Okay, so there is a part of me that makes me want to see how it ticks, and that's frustrating.
Yeah, the other interesting thing is that this begins with the sorting hat. We keep talking about it, but you have a whole bunch of binary choices. Now, on the one hand, like Stuart Moulthrop does this in one of the beginnings of Victory Gordon, which is also opaque, and deliberately, if you try to drive it where you want it to go, you're going to be sad. There's a different sorting hat at the beginning of Mary Kim Arnold's Lust, where, like lots of people want to drive Lust to the good bit, and you can't, because however much you try to psych it out, it's going to resist you. But this very big sorting hat is guarded against, like, taking the first choice every time, and that's quite useful. And in fact, hitting that convinces you that this is serious. The Dean of Liminal Studies, typo, Charlie Hargood and David Millard. I think, John, you just walked it. Now, this is right outside, and I urge you to take either of your kinds of phones, follow the link, and walk out and use your GPS to good literary effect. Make those satellites happy.
And the really fascinating thing about this piece, which I enjoyed more than I think I've ever enjoyed any other locative fiction, there's a node called BibliaCore. And I won't spoil it for you, but trust me when I say that no locative fiction has ever quite so accurately used the sense of place.
Very lucky, in a sense.
This is just a fantastic use of the space, the way that you walk around, the things that you, as I found myself looking down and then suddenly looking up when I finally get the dot to align and saying, oh, that's why they put me here. It's a terrific use of the actual real environment in a way that echoes what's going on in the fiction. And the fiction is just beautifully written. For any of us who are in academia, which I suspect is many of us, the idea of these rifts through which one sees the entire history of the academy compressed into the location where you're standing is just a superb use of hypertext and of specifically locative hypertext.
Extremely kind of you, John.
Yeah, thank you very much. So it's sort of it's kind of embarrassing to be on the same panel as you, to be honest. So we didn't discuss it in advance, but maybe just on our reflections on this, maybe I could say why we are doing this kind of thing, and then you can talk specifically about the thinking behind the Dean. So a few years ago, Charlie and I were involved in a big project to do locative fiction. And we were working with quite a few creative writing students, and we were commissioning authors, and we were really interested in the poetics of place. And I said to Charlie one day, you know, we've been looking at this, and on and off, I mean, we've been working in this space for a number of years, but we've never written a locative hypertext. We've never actually gone through the process ourselves. And the reason for that is that we're both computer scientists. Typically, we work with users who are experts, in this case, the authors, and we just felt that we didn't have the right to do that. So as it happened, we had a friend of ours, Alan Dix, who's a professor of HCI, who was running a sort of a workshop or a make space up in Scotland. And I said to Charlie, why don't we head up there, leave our English colleagues behind, and if you like, it then becomes a place where we can experiment and actually build something without worrying about whether it's good, which is because it's not going to be good. And I have to say, we did it, and we completed the piece, and it's there, but the piece isn't the point. The point was the experience and the insight we got from participating. And I can honestly say I have never done a piece of research that gave me more insight into a problem. It was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, just the realization of how difficult it is to balance all of the elements of hypertext writing was incredibly useful. And when we came back and we began, you know, we became good scientists and engineers again, and we were working with the domain experts at somewhat arm's length. But it gave us an empathy with them, which I found incredibly useful and has carried on in the last few years. So that's what put us in the mode of thinking we would give this a go. Perhaps you'd like to say a little bit about what we were trying to do with this particular piece.
Sure. So that experience, by the way, is written up in a paper called Tyree Tales that was at Prague in Hypertext 2 years ago. But before I go on to the Dean, just to echo what Dave was saying, I think there's a temptation as computer scientists working in interdisciplinary research to stay as far away from the domain you're working with as possible. You get your domain experts in to work on the project, and then you stay the hell away because that's the way to do it properly, because they're the experts. But the problem with that is that means that you're always looking at the things you learn from that domain through the lens of those experts. And sometimes just touching a little bit yourself, even if you don't expect to do anything of quality, allows you to contextualize what those experts were always telling you. I mean, when me and Dave wrote the thing at Tyree, suddenly all these things our authors have been telling us for a while started to crystallize and make a lot more sense. So yes, I actively encourage all the programmers in the room to have a go at writing and not worry about it being good. Anyway, to talk a little bit about the Dean, last year at Hypertext, I presented a paper with Dave on the idea of the problem of locative fiction and indeed locative systems is that they're often tied to one specific place. Okay, now that sounds obvious because of course it's about that place or using that place, but that's also a bit of a challenge because that means that your readership are only the people in the immediate area that can get to it. And indeed, as a scholar, when we started Story Places and looking at locative literature, we were instantly hindered by the fact that, okay, let's go and read some locative fiction. Oh, the nearest one is 300 miles away. Okay, it's very hard to learn more about the medium when that's the case, or even the systems. So we presented a paper last year about exploring this idea of trying to make locative media that maps to multiple locations. Okay, so this wouldn't always work. Obviously, if you're doing a tour guide for a specific area, then that wouldn't make sense. But a lot of locative fiction is using the area thematically rather than specifically. So how about we do a locative fiction where we tie to classifications of areas rather than specific areas, which is why in the workshop the other day, I started beaming and smiling when Deanie talked about how she was doing curation for locative fiction by mapping it to locations, because this is exactly what I've been talking about for a couple of years. So obviously, we don't have the tech yet. Me and Dave are writing a bid, and who knows if the UK is kind enough to us, we'll have a big pile of money to actually do the work with at some point. But we wanted to use this as an opportunity to do an experiment to see how this mapping process might work. So we thought, okay, we live at universities. The conference is at a university. Let's take our canned location as university, okay? So we thought, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to get together a couple of days, as we said to Mark, and we're going to write a story for Southampton University, which is where Dave is at, okay? We will classify the locations we pick for that, and then we will send that specification of locations to Klaus and his very generous student, who I don't know if is in the room or not. You anywhere here, Ben? No? Oh, right to the back, maybe? Hi. Who kindly took our requirements for location and went and found some locations around Hof for us to tie those nodes to. So jumbled it all into the system and released it into the wild, okay, to see how this would work. And yeah, there are some things to learn from that, I think. There are certain things that worked very well and certain things that were challenging about the mapping. Funnily enough, the biggest challenge, I think, although Dave and anyone who's read it can please feel free to interrupt me, wasn't finding locations that met our classifications, okay? There often are locations with that. It was to do with the structure of locations. When you're creating a locative narrative, you're not just writing a story and doing a story structure, you're also essentially designing a walk. You're designing a physical space. The network of those physical locations needs to sort of conform to a certain poetics and design as well. And what we found was while we still had the points, they were kind of jumbled. And it required a little bit of massaging on Dave and Ben's part in order to make the structure work again. So when we come to doing this as a research project, I think we're going to have to be very clever with our artificial intelligence in order to create an AI designer that can do that process.
Although just to add one last point, the spot you mentioned, the biblical space, that was the one that we couldn't map where we wanted it to be. So it's entirely serendipitous of what happens at that point, and it does show you that actually you don't have to be as controlled as you think, and sometimes you get these happy accidents which create quite special points.
One last thing, again, I'm not going to spoil what has happened with that location, okay? But one of the things we learned from our research project on locative narrative is that spaces change, okay? You are writing essentially onto a paper that is morphing and changing over time, okay? So your readers will be in a different state of being, in a different state of the place than you will necessarily be when writing. And sometimes, let's just say that state change helps.
Yeah, and in the book on getting started with hypertext narrative, I tried to develop this silly notion of painterly hypertext. And one of the ideas there is you're not going, you put stuff down, and sometimes it works far better than you meant it to. And just knowing, let it sit there. Wave by Jessica Tremblay, a rumble like a train passing through the library.
No, I couldn't either, sadly. So you may need to comment on that one for us there, Mark.
Okay. Bear with me a sec. There's always failed links.
So yeah, the other thing I must confess as well is that I'm a Windows user, so I haven't read the Mac.
Okay, I've got bandwidth trouble. We will move on. It will be linked properly tonight somehow. It's up there. It's surely a typo. Okay, I need to switch to which button do I push
Daniel?
to get the camera? Don't push the button. Wait for the button pusher. Okay. This begins with a preface you're not going to see while it's loading. It explains that it's a 48-hour hypertext that has so far taken 120 hours, and it's not quite finished.
We call that cheating.
Okay, so on this first screen, it says, press the buttons, your score and high score, which is much higher than my score. Ellie, get off that cell phone now. And, well, you can't read this, but this is the story of a teenage girl who is at Machu Picchu with her family. And her family is quite unhappy because she keeps looking at her cell phone, and she should be looking at the ruins and the vistas and the skylines and everything. And she cannot. She will not until she has a mishap and drops her cell phone. And of course, it goes over the precipice. And as you see, there is, it is actually not by our standards a hypertext. It is it's not a visual novel, but it's a native ebook. It's a book that has elaborate electronic affordances, little embedded games, little embedded Twitter feeds, messages from your friends saying, you're not paying attention to us, you're not paying attention to your cell phone, there's a special double points offer in the game we're playing, come on. So this is a very native and very elaborately done for a 48-hour or even 120-hour hypertext native ebook.
Yeah, and again, an example of what presumably this is participatory as a mode. Yeah.
One thing that I would suggest you take a look at is we have both this demo. That's better. This demo and storyboards. And to some extent, I think the storyboards are just as good as the iOS for our purposes in terms of thinking about this particular work. And like the conceit of we are dealing with the deprivation, a story about the deprivation of the girl in the story. And that's kind of nice. Okay, John McDade, Standing by the Wall.
Yeah, so I have to confess, I read this and thought, oh, this is what happens when someone who knows what they're doing is writing it. Yes, I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed the variety of it. I had a question for you, though, which was that again, this is the engineer in me. I was trying to work out whether any element of this was randomly generated or the order was mixed up dynamically. And if not, how did you then decide the sequence?
Well, you've got it. It is randomly generated. So there's a short introductory sequence of Lexia, just to set the stage, and then it drops into a purely random sequence. But what I did is there are two narrating voices that are separately. They're styled slightly separately, so you can tell them apart. Yes, and there's so many more of one narrating voice than the other. I wanted that always to be the predominating voice that was heard, even when it was randomly selected. So it is, every reading is different, and
Is it you still read everything, but it's jumbled, or is it a random sample from a wider set? So is it like composition number one, right, which is where you read everything but it's randomized, or is it a sample?
No, you read everything and it's randomized, and then there's a two Lexia tail.
Yeah, okay. Right. So, I mean, yeah, just to echo, I guess, some of the things that Dave said. I found this probably of the ones that I read the best written. Okay, clearly, as I say, Dave said, you know what you're doing, John. Okay, and also thematically, we're here to celebrate a hypertext conference about breaking down walls. Okay, and this is a story about walls and to some extent by walls. Okay,
Yes.
and that is fascinating in its own way. And some of the anecdotes in there aren't just like sort of fact drops, like a sort of pop quiz or anything, but you sort of spin those anecdotes and those facts into sort of interesting story points, which is really, really satisfying to read. I guess the question is, although these things are all connected to a theme, and obviously it's systematic in a sense because there is random, what is the key that you see as an author hypertextual element in this story?
For me, the idea of presenting a limited series of choices at the beginning, so providing a frame tale, and then allowing for chance, because I created all of these spaces kind of independently of each other, but with an overall theme in mind. And the idea of allowing the chance connections among them to produce associative meaning that will be different for every reading and for every reader.
Is this perhaps an example of a sculptural hypertext through chaos? In that all nodes are inherently, apart from the tails, obviously, connected, and the sculptor in this case is a chaotic maniac that carves nearly all of the links away, okay, in order just to leave one straight line through it.
And as we know in computer science, there's no such thing as pure random numbers, right? So the system itself is introducing some level of bias. So something is communicating through this choice of nodes that you get next.
I'm on the Lexia, the walls, guide, and yield. And I think about Michael Joyce's notion of the words, the yielding, right? The text that yields. And that's when you can hit the wave of return and words give. Is that what you're trying to reference with the word yield? Or was that just an accident, a happy accident? Okay. All right. So you're doing it on purpose. Good. Thank you.
Do you have anything else to add on this one, Dave?
Yeah, I should have covered this in the introduction, or John should, but John's first hypertext was Uncle Buddy's Phantom Funhouse, which is the first artifactual hypertext and literally gives voice to the dead. And John's also, I've forgotten the title, but John's also the author of a famous, I guess, novelette about an artificially intelligent elevator. So John has built quite a career of letting the inanimate speak, which seems quite an apt subject for hypertext.
It's a bit of a subspecialty for me. So my science fiction short story, which references Robert Coover's The Elevator, is called Jigoku no Mokushiroku, which is Apocalypse Now. And it features a sentient elevator, narrated by a sentient elevator. My second story, which is essentially a gloss on the Goldberg variations, is narrated by a sentient piano. So since this one is partially narrated...
An irritable sentient piano.
Sorry?
An irritable sentient piano.
Well, you would be irritable too if people just pounded on you all the time. I mean...
One more question for you, actually, John. So I wonder, how did you feel about the constrained nature of the 48-hour hypertext challenge? I mean, for me and Dave, it was a constraint, but because we're not official writers, quality was never a possibility anyway. So how did you feel as someone who's more of a trained writer being pressed to do this in such a frame?
Well, I will confess that I also submitted this as one of my MFA creative writing pieces. So I'm in the Newport MFA program, and so I submitted this. So it served a dual purpose. I also, between my time writing the Funhouse and writing this, I spent a lot of time as an IT project manager. So I actually divided up my time and time boxed things and said, here's how much time QA is going to take. And so I, allocated the time based on, back timing from when the thing had to go in.
I guess actually as well. So here's an interesting one, and please forgive me if this was absolutely not the case. But the nature of the sort of story that you have here, with the sort of the tales and the sort of body of sort of anecdotes and short story snippets, makes it quite pliable to a challenge hypertext, because you can scale that number of nodes that's going in based on how much time you have. You write until the clock runs down, and then that is that. Is that the case, or did you know exactly how many you were going to write beforehand?
I had a plane flight back from Dublin to Boston, and that was how long I had to write. So.
Okay, in Bond, me. I wanted to write a story about where Pussy Galore is now. I mean, after all, Pussy Galore was a teenager sometime in the 60s. So, like, she's 80 and she's living somewhere, and she's probably quite opinionated. And I want to know what her opinions are, and I want to know what she named her daughter. And so I sent a clueless protagonist trying to find her. Kathy Marshall, about a decade ago, suggested a spatial hypertext hyperfiction, which is even worse than sculptural. You really can't know what people are going to click next. And I had the experience with those Trojan girls of watching Deanie's wonderful traversal, in which she decided that let's forget the links and let's forget the sculptural links and all this infrastructure and treat this as a spatial hypertext. And yikes. So, talk about loss of authorial control and authority. Okay, fine. So that's what I was trying to do. What did I do?
So I was going to ask you, as someone who designed the tool in which you are writing, how do you think that affected your approach to constructing this piece?
Well, this was the worst writing experience I've had since I was an undergraduate. My experience was that there was plenty of time and lots of interesting things to think about and work out. And there was plenty of time, and then suddenly there was no time at all. And I was nowhere near to Pussy Galore. So in that respect, that dominated the whole experience. I'm also not using much of story space here. So this is the sort of stuff I've been doing for my own use in nonfiction for so long it's unconscious.
And yet one of the things that worked, I think, particularly well, because it's a riff on action films, is that you have a series of set pieces, which anyone who's ever watched action films understands. This is the grammar. There's a little stuff that happens, and then stuff blows up. And then, and then more stuff blows up. And the grammar works for you in propelling the story forward without having to worry about a whole lot of the intervals where you would write the serious parts, which worked very well in terms of getting you to where you needed to be with the protagonist by the end.
I think I just want to bounce off something you said there as well, Mark, about there being time and then no time. I think this is a real issue with hypertext, okay? Writing hypertext is a tremendous effort, okay? So I remember you saying so many years ago, where are the hypertexts? And it's because I think writing them killed all of the authors, okay? It's
Not in a good way.
That's right. I mean, well, look at television at the moment, right? I don't know, I'm sure, I hope anyway, most of the people in the room saw Bandersnatch, okay? And it took the same amount of time to make that one episode that it normally takes them to make a whole series of Black Mirror, and the entire production team swore off it and said, never again, okay? When me and Dave first started with Story Places, we hired a writer to write a story in the system, okay? And she gave us a fee for writing the story. We were like, fine, sure, gave her the money. And she came back to us after a month and said, look, no, I'm going to have more. This is a nightmare, okay? It is a tremendous task. When we did Tyree Tales out in Tyree with Alan Dix, I tried my best to restrain Dave's ambition, okay, because I said to him, look, we're only here for a couple of days. It's got to be a short story because the hypertext structure is going to kill us, okay? And sure enough, Dave's wild imagination meant that we had something that was 5 times what we really realistically could deliver on. For the Dean of Liminal Studies, we basically started with 3 pages. We wanted to deliver 3 pages of story snippets. And we added a bunch of pages to sort of support that as sort of like scaffolding, but developing those 3 pages basically took 48 hours, okay?
Yeah, I think it's, the main content is 6 nodes, and it's, the whole piece is about 15,000 words. So yeah, it's astonishing how it balloons. And managing that is a tremendous problem. And this is one of the things I meant about insights, because I think that's one of the things that you realize when you actually try and put these things together, that actually one of the main things we could be doing to support authors as systems builders is reducing their workload in some way and finding out what, the repetitive things that you have to do, how can we make those as slick and quick as possible so these things are achievable. Yeah, it's a big challenge.
Just one last thing to add on that. Give this to you, Didi, is that it's not just about increasing the number of nodes makes it more work. So yeah, branching story means more nodes, means more pages. It's that link design. It's the link style, okay? Understanding elegant structure is a design challenge equal to story structure. It's hard.
So I studied 45 of the Eastgate works. I've made it my life's work to read them all. And I think the most interesting one structurally is Mary Kim Arnold's. I just cannot tell you how beautiful that is. But going back to your comment, it's about, now we know why there's game engines and why game industries don't build new engines for every game. They just kludge on new stories onto old engines because they can't afford to create a structure for every game they release.
I completely agree, but the thing is with the engine is that there are already hypertext engines, right? Storyspace is a hypertext engine. Tinderbox is a hypertext engine. Story Places is a hypertext engine, right? We have the engines, and even with that engine, okay, putting the structure into it is a Leviathan task.
Yeah, but some engines lend themselves to more flexibility than others. Yes. And Storyspace is very, very flexible. It's very plastic, and you can do so much with it. There's engines that are a lot less time.
Okay, just one more before I'll let Dave talk. But you're absolutely right. But I've tried before with creating constrained engines, okay? And you're literally like author number 1 will run straight up against the edge and hate your engine, okay? You have to give them power, otherwise they won't create anything.
So I think it came up in Andy's talk this morning about patterns. And about the importance of patterns and supporting patterns and using them for education and also as a template for kind of software support. But a student and myself, we wrote a paper a couple of years ago on uncommon patterns. And what we were really talking about was that whenever you produce a piece, that piece has within it patterns which are unique to that piece, but which occur possibly hundreds or thousands of times. And actually, this, I think, is why so many bespoke authoring tools exist, because it takes you less time to write the authoring tool to deal with that uncommon pattern than it does do to just manually construct it. So having written a particular a piece, I think you could write a kind of a clone of that structure much more easily. But of course, at that point, creatively, you want to move on to something else. And I think that's a real challenge for us in terms of how we support people, is how do we deal with those uncommon patterns or these repetitive patterns that are sort of within a story rather than without.
anyone who's played any of Rockstar or Ubisoft's games has seen the cloned patterns.
Yeah, I also want to emphasize that some of the familiar writing problems that we don't discuss here probably take on completely new valences in hypertext, but this has been completely unmentionable in any polite society for years. One example, I had an intern, Morgan McCry, 2 years ago, who really wanted to write an agender character and insisted his pronouns were they, there, and you see, I can't do that. And my editorial pencil came out on every they, there. I couldn't help myself, and eventually I just edited everything and said, but this is hard. And so I set myself the challenge of writing a character without a gender here, and that was murder. Jill Walker-Retberg has a very interesting old paper on the IF community's affection for writing in second-person present, which is a valid choice, but actually it's not chosen. It depends on which community you grew up in, and that seems to be deeply, deeply wrong. And present versus past has huge ramifications, and I don't think it's ever been discussed in our literature.
So interesting enough, we wrote the Dean collaboratively, so we split the lexia between us. And it just shows that our lack of emphasis on the writing itself. So when I came to put the thing together and do I loosely call editing when I put the thing in, I realized that I'd written all of my sections in first person present tense, and Charlie had written all of his in second person past tense. And it's these kind of basic things can really catch you out if you're trying to get something done in 48 hours.
Mark, I think you've been waiting to say something.
It's slightly tangential, but it's something I hadn't really thought about till you said actually the time, how long it took. I mean, I haven't done any creative hypertext writing, but I have been writing a hypertext since 2004, which is my sort of outboard reference manual to Tinderbox, which I was just looking is now 2,349 lexia and lots of other structure inside. And I'm probably working on it pretty much every day because people keep finding things that I broke. But really the point is just to echo the fact that even writing outside a creative space, writing informative hypertext for somebody else's reading, is a lot harder than, in a sense, just cracking out an essay.
I'm sure anybody here who is a regular contributor to Wikipedia will echo that as well, right? Right. I mean, writing for non-fiction is still very difficult. You still have to think about those link structures. You still have to think about how that knowledge base is designed, okay? And it's that complicated structure and what makes most sense and what is the most sensible is really difficult. I mean, I've maintained wikis before and had to get about halfway through it and say, the structure's not working, tear the whole thing down, beginning again. Okay, it's difficult.
Yeah.
Okay, and we have one more work, Gun by John Don Johnson Ilola, a old time. This has sound, but I'm not sure that we're going to get it, which is bad because this is mostly about sound. But
I think you might be the only one who's had a chance to look at this one.
But this is clearly about Americans and guns, and the Midwest and guns, and film and guns, and. It is an audio mix. It's a set of film strips.
Falling asleep is the hardest part for me. Humanity is the something I long for. You are all going to die.
I told him that Laura and I and many across our nation are praying for the victims and their families and all the members of the university community who have been devastated by this terrible tragedy.
I didn't want to look weak. I love you with all my heart.
So it's a
I can make you believe anything.
console for making your own mixtape of misery.
Yeah, and incredibly affecting, right? I mean, really, even that short snippet is very sobering.
So I haven't had a chance to look at it. This was another one of the ones that was tricky to get running, but the concept is fascinating to me, and I think there's a lot more that can be done with audio hypertext than has been done already. I mean, obviously, it's not something that as a community we've not done. Okay, there are examples, but it is something that is a relatively sort of light touch territory. A few years ago, me and Dave wrote a bid for a project that sadly never got funded called Storyteller, where we were going to try and move Story Places into an entirely audio space with not just audio story, but also audio interaction and audio links. Okay, and there was this whole idea that we were going to be exploring to that, and how does the link function if it is solely audio? How do you create sort of audio links and audio navigation through a hypertextual structure? And we were working with Amazon to use the Alexa framework as a way to navigate that structure. But sadly, the project didn't get funded, so we never got to do the research in the end. But it remains, I think, a big unanswered question. So if anyone's looking for a research project.
No.
I'm good, yeah.
Well, we are more than out of time, but thank you all, and do look at the stories and write your own.
Of activities listed in the afternoon. However, sadly, in order to travel back, me and Dave need to leave at lunchtime on Friday. However, what we're going to do, it won't be a reading like John has of his story in a minute, but we will, just before lunch, give assuming this is still okay, Klaus, a short explanation of the work so that people can read it if they want to. Okay.
Yep. And if you want to try it in the meantime, it works on a browser, on a standard no app to download. But when it asks you whether you can share your location, remember to say yes, because otherwise it was a very poor locative experience. Yeah.